Hi. All right. It's time for our fireside chat. I'm super excited to be here with Kim Belair. And yeah, so Kim and I think maybe we should maybe introduce ourselves a little bit. Um,
Yes.
so I'm Meghna Jayanth, and I am a narrative designer and writer. And I was counting it up for this panel, and yeah, I've been in the industry for about 9 years now, which is a long time. I've worked on a whole bunch of games, most of them indie. My first game in the industry was 80 Days. And then I've worked on a bunch of things since then. Sunless Sea, Sunless Skies, DLC for This War of Mine, Falcon Age, and yeah, and like the game that I suspect we're going to be talking about quite a lot today, Sable, which is a lovely indie game made by Shedworks, which came out this year. Yeah, and I'm gonna hand it over to Kim to give a little intro as well.
Yes. So yeah, hi, I'm Kim Belair. I am also a writer and narrative designer, and I'm also the founder of a company called Sweet Baby Inc. We do narrative development across the games industry. I've actually also 9 years. 2013 is when I started at Ubisoft, so it's been 9 years for me as well. I think my first game that I ever worked on as a community developer was Far Cry 4, which I also started writing for. And then with Ubisoft, I did 2 Assassin's Creed games. And then outside of that, I worked on games including NeoCab, Sable, as we talked about. Yeah, the upcoming Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League, Hyper Light Breaker, Goodbye Volcano High, a lot of stuff through the company. And I'll do a quick Sweet Baby introduction because I think the framing is important here.
Mm-hmm.
We are a team of, I think, 13 now, and we are a collective of writers and narrative designers working full time in the industry on a variety of titles, kind of like a big contractor with a secondary goal of bringing new and marginalized developers into the industry in narrative work. So that's what I do. So I've kind of taken that little career shift. Sweet Baby's been around since mid to late 2018. And it's been the way that I now work primarily on games. So actually, Sable was a Sweet Baby project that I got relatively early into our like real career mid pandemic, I think.
Yeah, so I think let's start off with a little intro to kind of our work on Sable, I think. So really interestingly, Kim and I both worked on Sable, but we were not on the project at the same time. So we kind of collaborated asynchronously. And since the game came out, Kim and I have actually been trying to meet and talk about it.
Yes.
And it's been about a year, 2 years.
About a year, I think, because I mean, I remember that when you and I met, it would be at GDC like 2019, I want to say.
Good memory. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh wow, what an incredible conversation this has been," and I cannot wait to talk to her more. And then we didn't do it for several years, and here we are. But we did try. We put a
We
sincere effort into it, I think.
we did
Yeah.
try. So I mean, I think what's really exciting, why I was so excited for this fireside chat, and why I think it'll be really fun for the LudoNarraCon audience, is that this is the first time we've actually been able to discuss Sable together
Yes.
as narrative designers and writers on the project. So yeah, I'm kind of really excited to get into it.
It's
Um,
gonna be fun.
okay, so I guess maybe I'll start off with, so I was on the project uh, earlier, and I did world building and narrative design, and then we handed off to Sweet Baby to do all of the very, funny, charming writing in the game is all Sweet Baby's work, and Kim's work specifically.
Yeah, it was myself and David Bedard. I mean, there's a little support from the Sweet Baby team in general, and we had like a couple villains, but I think largely the writing of it for sure fell on me.
Yeah, yeah, which is, I mean, it's so exciting. And I think it really, if you've played the game, you know that the writing adds so much warmth and this beautiful tone. And that's super important. I think, especially a game like Sable, which is so, um, it can be so scattered. Like it's so sparse and beautiful and full of these, ruins and empty buildings. And I think without the warmth of the characters that you brought, Kim, it wouldn't be the game that it is.
Well, I appreciate that because it is something that I can actually lead with a little bit of tone because that was the first thing that I was curious about when I first joined the project and looked at the work that you had done. So I think what I can kind of start with is maybe you can talk a little about your the work that you did initially, because when it was handed off to me, the first thing I was met with was this like, oh wow, what am I going to do? How am I going to honor so much of this it's been laid out before me?
I mean, right. So I have to say, I can totally understand your trepidation in a way, Kim, because I did so much deep work, and I think if you're at all familiar with my work, I'm really into intricately researched sociological design, and I kind of went a little ham on Sable. Um, and Greg and Dan, who are the founders of Shedworks, when they came to me, they already had a 60-page document with all of the locations laid out. So they're clearly very detail oriented, like incredibly sort of intensely research driven people, which was kind of perfect for me. So yeah, I think I feel like I left you huge numbers of documents about like culture, history, cosmology, the types of crafts that people were using, types of materials, how that, kind of um, formed the, family structures, things like that.
Yeah.
And, but all of that, again, is like, this is the background. And I think it's super interesting for me to ask you about what you thought was important to kind of put across, or
Yes.
what you can hold back, because I think that's something that we don't talk about as narrative designers a lot, right? Like what we hold back from the player, and what informs our work but doesn't necessarily get communicated to them directly.
Yeah. That's that's an amazing question. It's really, yeah, really well asked and everything. I really, yeah, I appreciate that. I think the way that I looked at it, it's funny because I did come in with a sense of just fear. I think when I started, it is so impressive what you do. I think what I and this is not even to this is in no way to diminish myself,
Yeah.
but when I look at something like what you've done or even your body of work, I see you so much as like a writer and narrative designer so deeply, and especially like I see myself as a narrative designer as well, but the writing of it and the depth that you apply to things and the thinking that you do about it, and even your tweets, right, have like this incredible, no, it's true, like they have a poetic language, and you're so impressive to me as a writer, and I think of myself very much as a technician when it comes to writing. I don't mean that in a diminishing way, but I look at it and I feel like I'm like, okay, how do I best represent this? I'm thinking about more of an execution model. So there's
Hmm.
such an intimidation factor that I have when I feel initially like, oh, this is a work of genius and depth and things. And I am here with my tools to try to figure out exactly what you're asking, right? Which is what parts of that do I keep and what I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been very helpful because as part of Sweet Baby, we look at so many different projects, because the way that Sweet Baby works is we can be a writer's room if you need us to be. We can
Yeah.
also do high level narrative consultation or story consultation. We're kind of solutions based in that way. We come into a project, we figure out what we have to do, and we try to apply whatever we have to do. So I'm used to the process of telling people, okay, when you're thinking about building your world Bible, right?
Yeah.
Don't get too invested because you have to
Yeah.
remember what's going to ship, right?
Yeah.
But when I got onto this project as a writer, I'm like, this is no ordinary world Bible. This doesn't feel like it's a set of rules just for the world or a set of like lore that's not going to be formative or generative. It feels like this
Mhm.
is the logical, social development of this world, cultural development of this world, and all these different facets. So I truly came in and was like, I need to convey it all. And the enormity of that weight was like,
Yeah.
Meghna's work needs to be represented in every single way. So the first thing I thought was and foolishly, and this lasted all of a couple hours, but it was, well, I guess I have to write what Meghna would write. And I guess I have to be that good. I have to go, and I gotta be in this voice, right? And that again, the good thing I can say is that I never tried to ape your voice. I was like, let me look at this. But I remember early on in the tutorial
Mm-hmm.
there, and I'll speak to the tutorial because I think it's something that anyone who can grab the game and give it a shot can play, and I won't go too deep in it. But
Yeah.
in the tutorial, there is a lot of world building necessarily to onboard people into the way that the families work here, to onboard people into what the gliding is, to onboard people into how that works. And there's a moment where you encounter a child and you have a little conversation with her, and there's one, she's stolen something from you, and you get to answer her, you are a horrible child. You get to tell her you were a horrible child. And that was a line left behind when I joined the project that I maintained, because I was like, this is key to my understanding of it. Because that in a way was a moment where I realized that I was thinking about this too nervously, because I'm such an admirer of your work. And so I was coming in and going, I have to honor this by representing all of it equally on stage.
Yeah.
Whereas the answer was more in "you are a horrible child," because it made me laugh, and I was like, Sable is able to say this but still exist in this very complex world. And there's this tendency, I think, and I'm sure you know so much about this, right? Where I think when you do come in with a sense of culture, and when you do come in with any marginalization that you come and discuss, and you want to come with a perspective, right? All these different aspects of it that inform the work. You are tempted to make, or not you're tempted, but people are tempted to assume that has to always be serious.
Yes.
People don't
Yeah.
like to do genre stuff or comedy stuff, because they're like, we have to honor this and keep it very, and that's like always the wrong instinct for me, because what's most interesting is to make a character who's relatable. And I think what I kind of thought about in that moment is, why would Sable, a character from this world, say that to a child? It's like, the answer is because he's like us, because I would, and because you would, and she's young and she is
Yeah.
frustrated. And also I think what I tried to infuse in Sable was less of, oh, how would this cultural background inform her,
Yeah.
and more about just who she is, and how do I understand, like, what is her inner life. And no
Yeah.
matter how majestic the world is, she still exists in here. And so everyone she talks to can give her this moment of just like she could just get flustered and go like, oh no, I shouldn't have said this, or oh, this is so stupid, because it's just a moment that she's living. To us, it might seem like, oh wow, this is very interesting, but to her, she's like, I'm going to try to talk to somebody, and I said something embarrassing. And
Yeah.
kind of remembering that created for me like a channel that I said, okay, I'm going to read all this stuff. I'm going to learn what you've written about the world and its history, and I'm going to make sure that what I'm conveying is a person who exists in this but isn't thinking about it all the time, right? Which is, I think, so important. And I think is so much a part of your work. And I'd be curious as to how you approach it, because when you're writing all this stuff, you're writing like histories and depth,
Yeah.
but it's not intended to like you don't walk around the world constantly giving like history lessons to everybody. So yeah, I'd be curious as to how you kind of even approached that sort of world building.
Yeah, I mean, so first off, I have to say, Kim, I think you honored my work immensely. I think your work on this, I think what you just said about the sense of majesty of the world, versus the kind of normalness and normalcy of the characters that you brought into it, I think that's so key to why your work is so good.
Thank you.
And why Sable really works. And I think you're so right. Like, and that idea of like preachiness and seriousness. So yeah, the narrative design. I think that was partly why I was so glad that you were the person brought in to Sable, because there's so much detail in the documentation that I did, but there's no feeling really, and I hadn't gotten to like the small scale of, the character and the inner life. And for me, it's almost like, so back in the days of yore, I used to write fanfic, and in some ways, I think there's a similar process there, right?
Yes.
Like I really saw the world building documents as a way to create this world that then you just catch kind of glimpses of.
Yep.
And it's just there so that everything that you do feels integrated into something bigger,
It's
but you're
connective
not.
tissue, right?
Yes,
It doesn't have to be seen
scaffolding.
necessarily, but it will be felt.
Yes, and I think that's very much the same on 80 Days as well. Like, and I think that's probably something that I learned on that project, because for people who don't know, it's 80 Days is a text game which is massively branching, and on any given playthrough, you see about 3% of the content, and it's a kind of steampunk anti-colonial retelling of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, and I think that idea of any player is only going to see 3% of the content. There's no way you can tell them everything at all.
Yes.
In 3% of the game. So you kind of throw that idea out the window really early on. And instead you think about it as a way to make sure you're not contradicting yourself, and as a way to, I think, give you it's almost like writing prompts
Yes.
in a really basic way, right? Like it's to give you little little
Boundaries as well. You know,
yeah,
things that you can go, okay, how far can I push this? Does this make sense? And it's a nice, and again, when I think of that work as technical work, I
yeah,
find that often I see it and go, okay, what are the pillars of this? What are the means of expression, and what's the minimum viable product of it that I can express as well? Like, what's
yeah,
the least I can express of this world to still convey some
yes,
measure of it and to still feel like it's real. But it is true that when you step away from it and you convey a real person living in this world, you get a better
yeah.
sense for it because it doesn't require you to take as many leaps of faith. You can fill in those blanks yourself.
Absolutely. And I think also, one of the things I was keenly aware of, and I know I can tell from your writing that you are as well, is that this is a strange world, very alien cultures, and everyone is wearing a mask, so you don't have facial expression. And so how are you going to how are you going to allow the player in to really inhabit this protagonist and feel grounded in this very estranging, very eerie, mysterious, and you want to have all of that majesty and mysteriousness and luminousness, but that's not a fun character to inhabit, and it's wrong for Sable, right? Like
Yes.
maybe there are there's probably like a machinist high up who sees the world in this luminous way, but Sable is a young person going on this gliding, and she's a little bit of a shit as well,
A
right?
little
I'm
bit.
sorry, I don't.
Well, she's
I hope so.
she's that, but she's also like, I think, perhaps in the way of me and some of the folks who I was thinking of, especially when writing her, it's that way of just like, she has that side of herself, but she also has a side that's like kind of rude to herself as well. And to be
Yeah.
constantly thinking, because she's young, right? She's constantly thinking about what she is saying.
Yes.
And to
Yeah.
make sure that, like, when I was writing like her answers, it was mostly based on like, oh, what does she think she should say here?
Yeah.
And her very
That
little comfort with that.
right, and that need to like be a grown up in some senses, right?
Yes.
Which at that coming of age period, you want to be taken so seriously, and it's the great tragedy of the teenager that nobody does take you seriously,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And of course, like looking back, you realize you were maybe histrionic about some things, but also you felt things so deeply, and I think that really comes across with Sable. So, just on a mild tangent, there's like a couple of lines because I was just thinking about my replay and like you know, I think it was there's like like Scrapper Alton. I mean, this is just like a tiny little character that you wrote, but just something about that whole character is just about like the mundane reality of work. And Sable is like, oh, I had this big fantasy of being a scrapper, and like, oh, that it would be so romantic and jetting out across the dunes, and and there's a moment of like recognition of that fantasy, and he really puts paid to that as well because this is just his job. It's so mundane to him, and I think that contrast that you really brought of this incredible mysterious kind of world is mundane, and I think that's also why it really avoids exoticism, which is something that I know like we both think about.
Yes. That was a
I,
big part
yeah,
of thinking about taking anything from what you did, because I think that was exactly what I think what the risk is. And I think if you had, there are writers who might not have that same background, but I know, because of my own background, because of my own experience, because of my own work, it's something that I was acutely aware of even in the text.
yeah,
Because I think that what I noticed most about like the work that you had left in this like spectacular like discussion of both the timeline and the culture,
hmm,
was that there was a sensibility that was not about, let's build a timeline based on this world's most unpleasant moments.
yeah,
It's, here's how culture has emerged. Here's what art looks like. Here's how celebration is like. Like, I went in such a wildly different, like, there is a character named Laura the Fabulist who I think is one of the most
yes.
changed characters from you to me. But I
I
think
really wanted to talk.
what's,
Yeah,
yeah, so we could get to that after, because I think that when I read it, there was, first of all, there was going to be more with that character, and it ended up
hmm,
being just scoped down to a single moment.
of course.
So there were things that I had to change, but my thinking on it was like, you've created a person here who is connected so much to the art world, and who has some rough personal opinions and ways that they are diminishing Sable, and I'll let you kind of speak. I'll let you kind of speak to more to that and that change because I think it's important. But yeah, so much of it was just about saying like I want to see the real life here, and that's the other thing is like you were very very attentive to the reason that things existed, to the idea of like when we talked about this faction or group called the Atomic Priesthood,
Yeah.
and they are built around this idea of caution and
Yes.
around being careful around the nuclear waste that did exist in the history of the planet, and
Yeah.
they've evolved, and whether or not there's still any danger to it, right? They still exist, and that was such an interesting thing because it's like, oh, that is how that would be formed. Like
Yeah.
that is how we form our religions. We form our religions on rules and on things we should avoid. And I was like, oh, that's really really interesting
Yeah.
perspective. And it's like I'm so used to a lot of projects that are like, well, first there was a war, and then there was a second war, and then this person became the king. And it's like, no, this is
Yeah.
about a movement, about people, about art, about language, about all these different things. And that really helped me to go, oh, this isn't a world where I need to be thinking about the event.
Yeah.
Like that's it. And
Yeah.
I felt very much like the way that I see that is something like the gliding by another writer. I think if someone else had established that, could have been very cruel, because I do
Mm.
think that when, especially like in the West, and especially with like writers who don't have that, who don't have a background like ours, then they might go to that and go, this thing looks primitive to me, and
Yes.
therefore it must be cruel.
Yeah.
Therefore, it must be dangerous and less human. And so the
Yeah.
gliding, I think, could be something that's like, oh, you go away from your family and we don't care about you anymore, because in
Yeah.
this culture, they don't care about their kids. It's like,
Yeah.
and so a big part of the first work that I wanted to do was just making sure that it was conveyed that this is very human. This is very warm. There are always supports. There's always love and kindness. And that's a thing that I really wanted to, I think, honor from your work, and also just present in general through a character like this, because the strangest to people of the masks could be cold. So let's
Yeah.
push the warmth, right? This place could be vast and terrifying. So let's make community a very strong point for us. And that was something that, yeah, I think is shared between the asynchronous work that we did.
Yes, no, entirely. I think what was really important for me was to avoid the kind of Anglo-American post-apocalyptic tropes,
Yes.
right? The tropes that we have under Western colonial capitalism. And I think Sable is in the aftermath of disaster in some ways, right? Like, so there clearly was, there's nuclear waste everywhere. In the long backstory of this, there's clearly an event with ships crashing. So it is in the kind of ruins of capitalism and empire, and the monumentalists were clearly a much more feudal / capitalistic culture. I mean, building enormous monuments tends to require that kind of organization. Um, but I think it was super important that this was about how do people rebuild in after a way of life ends, and actually people are interested in art. People have culture. People have there's community. There's warmth. There's survival.
Yes. Which
And yeah,
I think I want to actually go off on that, because one of the pieces that I didn't write the final draft of, but I directed, was written by Pelos Savousis, who did just a little pass on the ships and the story that's
yeah,
told about the way that the ships work, and he did great work on that. And what I thought was really good, and what I wanted to convey in that section, was exactly what you're talking about, which is that it is a tragedy, and it is not even a tragedy. It is a major event. It had detrimental effects on
yeah,
people and on the world and on this, but the story is also one of people who arrived somewhere and decided to make a life here.
yeah, yes,
And the focus for me is on, yeah, this happened to us. And one of the last things that I really really liked about that section was like, this is a sad thing for us to remember, but in the
yeah,
moment, the captain who's in charge of this had to go, okay, this has been bad, but I need my folks to survive. Let's try to make the best out of a bad situation, and find what we can. We're going to put masks on because we need them, right? And we're going to do this. And eventually, ages later, that becomes part of the culture, right? Whether or not it's
Yeah.
it's a question, right? Whether or not they're needed at all at this point.
Yes.
I
I
suspect,
think there really is.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're familiar with this play called Mr. Burns. But that was, so it's a play that is actually, it has, I think every act you move forward something like 100 years or several hundred years. And so it starts off with, kind of in contemporary times, and it's all around about a Simpsons episode. And then you go 100 years later, and that Simpsons episode becomes the focus of this culture. And, but it's become strange and weird in the retelling, and so many normal aspects of it have become exaggerated. And then 500 years later, I think everyone is wearing enormous masks, and like it's become part of this kind of religion. And I think it's a kind of, I think I saw that at GDC. It was playing at the across from the hotel that I was staying at, and yeah, and I think that kind of, that sense of, I think, what you were talking about earlier as well, things that have made sense in the past now are continued. And that's how kind of culture is passed down. And things become kind of ritualized. But again, that ritual isn't necessarily something primitive or other. Like, we have so many rituals, even in our world, that kind of maybe make less sense or no sense.
Yes.
Just as a little side note, I think as you came on board, there was also the beginning of the pandemic. And I wonder if that had any sort of impact on you thinking about masks and
Yes.
and kind of apocalypses and things like that in Sable's world.
So yes, I will say two things though. And this is going to get sad for a second,
Yeah.
because during the development of Sable, I lost my father, and it was not to COVID, it was to cancer, but it was during the pandemic, and I know that was very much a thought that I had, and I think the pandemic gave me a space, I think, to sit down, and I was so happy to have Sable, because my most
Yeah.
comfortable mode of writing, just like to be casual about it, is prose. And so
Yeah.
it was a very good comfort and a reassurance at a time when I felt very deeply uncertain and shaken, to be able to do something that I felt comfortable in, and that allows a space to like explore
Yeah.
like who that character is, and kind of, work on it in that in a way that I felt really connected to, and that allows me to, in the text, kind of question what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because Sable's constantly questioning what she's doing. She's constantly thinking, did I say the right thing? Should I have said that? And oh no, or she's also having little moments of joy where it's like, yeah, I really said the right thing there. And I think that was something that, exploring that world, and again, yeah, a world of mass, a world of isolation, a world where social groups feel few and far between. And then, yeah, my father passed away, and I finished a lot of the writing. And there's a character in Sable, Elizabeth, who
Yes.
was the proposal behind her character, and I think what you left there was that she was trying to find a space in the world to explore, but she was in her 50s, or she was much older,
Yeah.
and the idea was essentially that, like, she was retiring and wanted to go explore. And I think the hints that were included was that this was kind of a second gliding for her, a second coming of age, and I made that more explicit, which is, that's what Elizabeth wants. She wants to come in and see the world. And that, for me, and that relationship was one of the first things that I wrote for the game, in depth. Like I had done a little bit of like just testing out language and stuff, but it was the first set of missions that I did. And it helped me so much to imagine myself feeling uncertain, very small, very insignificant, and simultaneously looking at a vast and terrifying and intimidating and beautiful world without any guidance, right?
Yeah.
And I, like, my father in many ways was my North Star. I have a wonderful family, and I love all of them, but I would say that, like, in so many ways in my career and everything, my father's been very, very helpful. And so losing him, I felt very akin to Sable. And the mission with Elizabeth was a little bit of, like, not wish fulfillment exactly, but the idea of, I had always hoped that at some point in my own success, I would get to give my father some of the space and the time that he had given me, and that he would be able to have that adventure that he wanted. He was such a hard worker. He was such a dedicated person, and always made sure that everyone else was taken care of before himself. And in Elizabeth, I wanted to write a character who got the chance to do that. who got the chance to be at the end of her working life and to still take that time to explore the world and to know someone young and to tell them this is something you should do as well, and to not take this so seriously, to not think that you're gliding, however it defines the job that you'll start with will ever define you. And you will have another chance at this, and not to take it seriously and to have fun and to enjoy this at a time because it's about yourself. And then to imagine what it might have been like for someone of that age. And my father's exactly who I was thinking of, because it's what I didn't get a chance to have with him. I didn't get a chance to have him go into the world and experience the freedom that I wanted, but right. And so I put it into that. So that was hugely formative for me. And the pandemic was kind of like the tenor of that, because it meant that there was a distance between us, that there had to, because he was so immunocompromised there, we had to be very careful. I didn't get to spend as much time with him as I would have wanted, but I was always there. And so it's like that kind of, that moment will always live with me. And I don't know how relevant it is to the grander discussion of the world, but that always sticks with me as when, for me, all those things of the tone that I had wanted to achieve was there, the stuff that I had taken from that, and then now I was given this character. And it was also, the last thing I'll add about this thing is that I was working with a younger woman at a company. She had, Amy Shaw, actually. She's at Rocksteady, and she reminded me very much of Sable in a lot of ways. And the relationship that I had with her was such that we were working together on Suicide Squad, and I was like, she's an amazing junior writer. She's so cool. She's so enthusiastic. She's so ready for the world, and I want to be able to help her out as well. And another friend of mine, Olivia, who's folks that I'm like, I want to try harder to be that way. I want to see the Sable in people and to try to help them out. So it was super formative in a way that I'm barely unpacking now, because grief lasts forever, turns out. But that's where I think a lot of it came from for me.
I mean, I think that really came across because I think in some of the player discussions of Sable, I see Elizabeth mentioned all the time, and she's often, I think, the first character that people mention and remember. And I think her story feels very emotional for a lot of people. On a slight sort of tangent to that, but maybe related, is did you read much of the critical response to Sable, and how did you feel about it?
So I read some of it. I would say that, like, it's one of those, right? You kind of decide where you're gonna put that, but
yeah,
I did. And
you have to really decide your
you have to decide,
before.
And so, well, it was interesting because I think that I consider you so formative, and obviously, like, everyone on the team at Shedworks, but I think there's that weird thing that happens when you don't know what to take ownership of or how much of it. I find that game ships are so odd in that way, where you're like, I simultaneously feel very connected to this, very responsible for it, and also not at all. And I think
no. I think you're utterly responsible for it. If I would say you have had a bigger role on this, and
I appreciate it. Well, no, but I think it's with any game, right? I always go like, there's so much, it's a full package.
So collaborative.
Yeah, it's so collaborative that I'm like, okay, well, I own this, but yeah, it's, people have been very, very kind about the game and have resonated with it, and I'm very grateful for that. And I did see, like, a couple of folks call out. I know one person on Twitter also called out, like, Elizabeth's particularly, and I've always thought to myself, like, yeah, I'm really glad about that. And I think I don't often put that much of myself into everything that I do, right? Or at least not something that's that quickly invulnerable. I think I tend to do it more like, here's after the fact, here's a thing that happened to me, I'll put it in here. But this was like, oh, this is happening right now, and to write this feels very very real and very raw. Yeah.
It's funny because actually the project I'm on currently is called Thirsty Suitors, and it's with Outer Loop, and I'm having a very similar experience.
Okay, I'm very excited about this because I had written down some questions about this, and I know we're approaching time, because I would love to talk about it, and I would love to talk about your approach to to bringing yourself and how it feels to put so much of yourself out there, which
Yeah,
I imagine you're doing.
absolutely, because I love my intricately researched sociological histories and my world building. Whereas this is so, Thirsty Suitors is it's a coming of age story, which kind of like Sable, about a young South Asian woman who is coming back to her hometown after a horrifying breakup and estrangement kind of from her family. Everyone's really pissed off with her, and she comes back into town and kind of goes on a little bit of a reconciliation tour. So she kind of um, battles all of her exes. So it's very hard to describe. Like it's kind of a little bit of a new genre, and I don't think you'll have seen anything like this. And I'm just gonna say you should wishlist it on Steam, because Eka from Outlook will never forgive me if I don't. But so there's kind of a little bit like insult battles. So it's turn-based combat, but a little bit like Monkey Island insult battles. There's a little bit of like cooking. So one of the mechanics is your mom's teaching you how to make food, and she's always unimpressed by what you do, which is super relatable for me. My mom is lovely about it, but I'm very intimidated by her as a cook because she's an amazing cook. And so there's a lot of myself in there. And yeah, it's so.
How have you felt now? Because I find that when there is research, when there is like a lot of tangible
Yeah.
or empirical stuff that you can draw from, it's very good to be able to say these are giving me reassurances. This is giving me some evidence and some logistical things to rely on, so I don't have to pull out my own heart and throw it down there. I can kind of like use these
Yeah.
things. But now, yeah, like how is that shift to now? It's like, oh, you are yourself the roadmap in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's about intergenerational trauma, family expectations, being a lot of the things that I think about deeply at work, right? Like the pressure of being a minority, a person of color, representation. I mean, a huge part of. So see, I've immediately gone into the intellectual side of things, but on a personal note, um, it's so personal. The difficult part of this was I would start writing pieces of dialogue for the game and then realize, oh no, this is for my therapist. This is not for the game. And and it actually has forced me to confront so many things. Like I've had to do so much work in therapy to be able to write some of this, and I've, as a result of having to face up to some of these things, I've had to take things into therapy, and it's just very unusual. It feels very raw. It feels very vulnerable, but it kind of feels very necessary and important because. So going into the intellectual side of things, I think one of the things I really wrestled with was the weight of I think like James Baldwin calls and Toni Morrison call it the little white man in your head as this
Oh my
as
gosh.
this kind of this figure that's constantly criticizing or judging, or that's your audience that you think about, and you're constantly thinking, how is this going to be received by the audience, and how is this going to be received by this white man as well?
Well, I feel like I had that little white man, that little white man in my head for like the beginning of my career, like prior to video games, even or the very beginning, where
Yeah.
I would police my own writing. I found
Yes,
myself
exactly.
writing white stories or writing stories about white people, especially or white men,
Yeah,
because I'm like, that's what a story should be,
that's
and
what a story.
that's what's going to be serious. And I think
Absolutely.
I was not a fan fiction writer, but
Yeah.
I was adjacent to those communities. And I knew about them, and this idea of a Mary Sue was so deep in my
Terrific.
head, right, or in my heart that I was like, oh, if I put some of myself into this story,
Yeah.
it is selfish, it is indulgent, it is uninteresting to most people because it is too personal, right? And you have to
Yeah.
kind of fight that and realize, and for me, it was a very big shift towards realizing, no, it's new.
It's
It's we haven't
new.
seen
Oh,
it.
Kim.
It's yeah. I think the year that we met, I did a talk at GDC that kind of went into this. And it was called Representation as Innovation, and it
Yes.
was realizing that wait a second, our stories aren't just
Yeah.
niche. They are new and innovative. And the same way that we are praising innovative tech constantly in games,
Yeah.
right? Or innovative graphics, it's like, what about innovative perspectives? What about
Absolutely.
innovative like aesthetics, stuff like that, right?
Yeah, and internality, right? I think absolutely, like Sable's internality is unlike most game protagonists I've seen. I mean, I think there's a sense of tone around it. Like, it's like, and Zelda, there's that sense of like adventure, optimism, all of these things. But the protagonist in Zelda doesn't get an internality. And I think you're completely spot on. And I think for me, in some ways, 80 Days was still, I'm super proud of that work. But in some ways, that was me wrestling with whiteness. And it's almost, I think of it now as almost an attempt to talk to well-meaning white people. Yes. To an extent, right? And to kind of draw them in and be like, look, we're human. Here's our humanity. And look, isn't it interesting? Almost like you're offering up yourself. Whereas I think of Thirsty Suitors as there's a little bit of a distance, and it's almost like, come be a guest in our home.
Yes.
Come and I will show you our culture, and come and embody this character who's maybe unlike someone but isn't that exciting?
That's exactly it, right? We are asked to inhabit all of these little creatures in games, right? Yeah. And we're told that, like, see through the eyes of this, and it's this like idea of, isn't it cool that you can have powers? Isn't it cool that you can be this? And it's like, this is a different perspective that we're honoring, and this is a different way to experience this game and this world, and the perspective of that protagonist and the culture that you're immersed in is going to be new to you. And if you aren't from that, if you're from that background, it's going to be deeply resonant. And if you're not, it's going to be deeply informative. And that for me is like, oh, that's going to build an understanding and a newness and exploration in a very safe place to do that, because it is authored by folks from that background who can make sure that you are understanding the right stuff. I imagine it must be like a very simultaneously very scary and very freeing.
Because I think the dearth of stories out there, I think, also places so much pressure on us as narrative designers and as writers, right? Like, you're almost coming into this trying to define a new space, which is incredibly exciting and a space for so much innovation and growth, but there's not that many precedents. And I think there's a lot of expectation on the part of the audience as well. And I think sometimes that's great. Of course, audiences should have those expectations, but sometimes the story can be just the story, and it doesn't have to be every single story. And it can't be every single story. And I think if you try and do that, you lose the humanity and you lose the specificity, and that is where the work comes in. And so I realize we're winding down. So I was wondering, Kim, is there anything that you want to talk about? Like, what you're working on currently?
I should do that, but I also I did want to talk about Thirsty Suitors and Benbow, though, being on Tribeca, because congratulations to.
It's so exciting! 2 South Asian immigrant games.
It's
and about
awesome.
Cooking.
Yeah, we worked with I'm just so thrilled by it. We worked with Neha Patel, who is doing music and audio for Vemba. I'm just like, oh, I could not be happier to see those projects. But yeah, we have a lot of stuff that we're working on right now. Hyperlight Breaker is something announced. Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League. We have a lot of stuff, but yeah,
it looks so good.
There's really cool stuff coming down the pipe, and we work on a lot of different things, and that's really cool. But I think, like, largely I would more say look out for Sweet Baby if you are someone who is interested in games writing and narrative, and whether you need advice, connections, just someone to talk to, portfolio stuff. But also, even if you don't have portfolio stuff and you just have questions, please know this, because a quick note on portfolios. I feel like the system that we use implies that there's a meritocracy here, but right? There isn't. So if you just need questions or advice, at Sweet Baby Inc. There. And Meg, you can talk about where you got cool stuff coming up. You can talk about find you.
My one is really Thirsty Suitors, and it is like an all singing, all dancing, vibrant, colorful, joyous exploration of like immigrant love with battling your suitors, cooking with your mom, skating as well. So like there's a little bit of everything for everyone. And our demo is at Tribeca next month. And I'm not sure if you can just register and play online. I suspect you might be able to. We just did put voices in, and that's actually a new process. I've never actually been in the room where actors were speaking my lines, and I thought it would be excruciating, but it's incredible, and actors are amazing, and good
Yes.
actors are like, oh, bring so much life to a project, and I'm
It
just
changes everything.
it changed everything, and
Yep.
I'm so humbled by it. But yeah, so um yeah, it's I mean, I think it's an exciting time. I mean, I had so many questions to ask you, Kim, like you know,
You know,
working indie versus triple A, and starting your own thing. But yeah, you know, but I mean, how do you feel about it? I know that there's like I'm about to ask you like a big question right before we go, but all of the acquisitions and mergers and the increasing platformization, which is worrying, but at the same time, there's never been more perspectives and more
yes.
innovative types of games in the indie space, particularly. So, yeah, how do you feel about that?
I think, I mean, a lot of it's bad in terms of like the way that we're handling a lot of these mergers, but I do think that what I'm really hopeful about is that if there's anyone who knows how to move through this world and the most dangerous of spaces and to protect themselves and to understand systems, to learn them and to be able to cut through, it is a lot of marginalized folks. And
That
so I
is,
do think that is the benefit, and that is what I'm always trying to learn, and what I think we need to get, or we are good at, because we have to be, right?
yeah,
And I think that's the hope that I have, is that no matter what these systems are doing, the people who can see them are able to learn how to navigate them. And I think I just want to keep moving through it in that way, and keeping ourselves safe, and kind of
yeah,
creating this little submarine that we're all safe inside, but
yeah.
that can navigate these places that otherwise would not have us. And
Yes,
that's the biggest thing.
and I think it's probably both of us are deeply invested in the idea of like kicking that door open
Yep,
for, you know, that next
always.
generation and other voices, and kind of I think in a way that adds a certain amount of pressure as well, because you know, like the success of some of you really want to have this
Yes.
project that is about a specific perspective be successful, because you want that to open the door
The
further
most
from,
frustrating vector, right? Like the most frustrating thing where you're like, oh, well, it doesn't just ride on my professional success. I also have to now represent something that I hope succeeds, so that people
yeah,
won't associate a failure with yeah, 100%. But we're gonna do it.
yeah, so it's kind of amazing that we managed to get
Yeah.
all, you know, so that's kind of the background work I think that you and I do as writers and narrative designers in order to be able to do our real work, which requires, just as you talked about, I think, you know, actually getting out of your head and just focusing on the story and being real and being truthful in some way. And I think, you know, games are such difficult, collaborative, technologically mediated beasts and so new, that it's and our job is really to make sure that there's some soul and there's some humanity there,
Yes.
and it's often an uphill,
Yeah, and
complicated
sometimes you only get a
battle.
little bit in there, and it's hidden, but
Yeah,
it's worth it. You know, like you can point to it, and I think the more you do, the more games we work on, the more I think we become comfortable with the idea of you bring something to it. It doesn't matter if you change the whole of it, but you've done something that has moved the needle, that has represented yourself, and will serve a purpose for those coming afterwards. And
yeah,
that for me, that's the hope. And I go into every project, I think, with
yeah,
that idea of like, I can change something. I can definitely
yes,
bring this somewhere.
yeah. I think that's a really healthy way to look at it,
Oh,
actually.
it's a work in progress.
Well, we're all very much works in progress on that front. To me, the big one is kind of separating my own sense of self from like being productive and doing a good job, and I get very in my own head. I have again that feeling of like imposter syndrome, and I think that for me, you
Yes.
know, I think it's I talk about it because I think it's useful to know like it never goes away, even if you win a bunch of awards, even if you work on successful things. But yeah, you got to power through that. All right, okay, I think
For
that's time
time.
for us. I still have like so many questions.
We'll follow up. Like there.
We should actually have Zoom wine at
I was
some
gonna say we're
point.
gonna have Zoom wine, and then we won't hijack the feed later on
That's true. That's true.
to do it. But yeah, have a great LudoNarraCon.
Yes. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a great LudoNarraCon. Take care, guys.